In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you why heavy thrusting swords are the greatest weapon in Elden Ring. This is the 12th video in our series where we go through every weapon in a given category and sort of show you the pros and cons of those weapons so you can make a decision about whether or not you want to add them to your build. Before we get into the weapons themselves, however, first let's talk about the pros and cons of this weapon group as well as the playstyles I think most players will use when using them. So first, taking a look at the pros of this weapon group, usually they have fairly long reach, meaning that you're going to be able to hit enemies from further away or start your attack from further away, allowing you to strike them before they can hit you in many cases. And because these weapons deal thrust damage, you're going to get extra counter damage when you hit them and they're in the middle of an attack, which is easier to do with this weapon than thrusting swords themselves. And this allows you to make good use of the Spear Talisman to further increase that counter damage. And just like thrusting swords, they have the option to do feints, meaning that if you go to do a charged R2 and hit the dodge button, you will dodge backward and attack in the same animation, allowing you to complete your charged R2s early while still getting a strike that doesn't deal as much damage, but then dodges you out of harm's way. Another really great feature of this weapon group, same as thrusting swords, is that they can block and attack at the same time, which allows you to turtle with like a great shield or something like that, and poke enemies from behind it safely. This is really nice because it allows you to deal with enemies that you're not familiar with their moveset without having to risk getting attacked. And lastly, their R1 attack chains are fairly fast, allowing you to keep enemies staggered and not being able to attack you most of the time. The cons of this weapon group are that they deal almost exclusively thrust damage, and if an enemy resists this damage type, you're kind of in a world of hurt. Talking a little bit about the playstyles I think people will use, I think there are really three playstyles that most people using heavy thrusting swords will use. And that's first, dual-wielding heavy thrusting swords using their L1 attack in order to deal very, very high damage more than thrusting swords because these weapons are heavier, and allowing you to build up attacks, using like Rotten Wing Sword Insignia or some sort of talismans like that, increasing your attack power, just dealing more and more damage as you attack over and over. Another option is to use one of these with a shield in order to have sort of like a block counter build that allows you to poke from behind the shield without taking damage, and that's very, very effective with this weapon as well. And then lastly, probably just using a single heavy thrusting sword leaning into the Ash of War, the weapon. For instance, if you're using something like the Godskin Stitcher, you could use Seppuku to trigger bleeding with your R2 attacks, or if you're using something like Bloody Helice, you're going to use L2 in order to dodge out of the way with Dyna's Finesse and then follow up with R2 attacks, not really needing anything else in that build. And the same is true for Dragon King's Cragblade as well. This weapon has a fantastic weapon skill that kind of allows you to just abuse it. Moving along to the weapons themselves, let's start with the two non-infusible heavy thrusting swords first, and the first one is the Bloody Helice. The Bloody Helice shares the same moveset as the Dragon King's Cragblade and has a wider arc on the backward sweep feint attack and deals physical damage. This is the heaviest heavy thrusting sword in Elden Ring, weighing 8, and requires some points in Strength, Dexterity, and Arcane in order to use. The Bloody Helice has the lowest attack rating of all heavy thrusting swords, but it is the longest of the bunch. It has an exceptional weapon skill in Dyna's Finesse that allows you to spin through enemy attacks via iframes and follow up with devastating R2s that are affected by Warrior Jar Shard and Shard of Alexander. It also has very high native bleed buildup on hit, allowing you to rip off huge chunks of HP while also buffing yourself with things like White Mask or Lord of Blood's Exaltation. Dyna's Finesse provides you a means to dodge much more effectively than rolling and is unaffected by equip weight, allowing you to stack armor to the moon and not have to worry about fat rolling. However, it consumes more stamina than a normal roll, and you'll need a huge investment in endurance in order to be able to use Dyna's Finesse at will, so when using this weapon, do not skip placing points into this attribute. Additionally, the Green Turtle Talisman and Viridian Amber Medallion can also help with stamina management. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 50 Arcane, 30 Dexterity, and minimum Strength. It scales very well with both Dexterity and Arcane from this point forward, though, making it particularly good for NG Plus and beyond, and you'd be wise to take both of these to 80 before placing points into Strength. Since the Bloody Helice has fantastic arcane scaling, the Dragon Communion Seal is a viable pairing if you wish to sling some spells too. The issue here is that unless you dedicate some points to Faith, you'll have a very limited selection since most incantations require Faith in order to cast. This means you would be limited to Blood or Dragon incantations simply because you won't have the needed attribute points to meet the requirements for this weapon, Pump Arcane and Pump Faith. However, if you decide to play Journey 2 or 3 with this weapon, you'll be able to accomplish this much more easily. I recommend focusing on the use of Dyna's Finesse when using this weapon as I did in my Bloody Ballerina build, stacking stamina so that you can use it whenever you want, and slotting Lord of Blood's Exaltation and Shard of Alexander for increased damage. Focus Arcane and Endurance for best results. Moving along, we have the Dragon King's Cragblade. The Dragon King's Cragblade shares the same moveset as the Bloody Helice and deals physical and lightning damage. It is the heaviest heavy thrusting sword in Elden Ring, weighing 8, and requires some points in strength and a lot of points in dexterity in order to use. The Dragon King's Cragblade has the highest damage of all heavy thrusting swords, doesn't weigh much, and has the second longest reach of all heavy thrusting swords, losing to the Bloody Helice by a small margin. However, it does have split damage between physical and lightning, making it less effective in some cases. Its weapon skill, Thundercloud Form, hits like a truck and can be used from a modest distance by holding down L2. This is not a charged attack, however, and is therefore not boosted by Godfrey Icon, though Shard of Alexander and Warrior Jar Shard do affect it. You can actually navigate while moving through the air while holding L2 though, allowing you to change directions and maneuver around obstacles. This allows you to cast it safely behind cover and move into an enemy that you don't have line of sight on. The sweet spot for this weapon is at its minimum strength requirement and about 50 dexterity, but it scales well all the way up to 80 dex. From this point forward, you'll increase strength, which scales okay to 50, but not well after this point. This allows you to use this weapon in NG+ effectively, but you may have difficulty in the second half of NG++, and I don't recommend going further than this with this weapon. Because the Dragon King's Cragblade is primarily a dexterity weapon and cannot be buffed, it doesn't lend itself well to hybrid builds that spellcast. Instead, you should focus on the strength of this weapon, which are its weapon skill, the fact that you can block and attack simultaneously if you have a shield, and that it deals relatively high damage for its weight. This will allow you to block effectively as well as block counter well with a slight investment into strength to get a great shield like Icon Shield or another with low strength requirement. Use the Curved Sword Talisman to boost your block counter damage, and consider using Carrion Filigreed Crest and Assassin Cerulean Dagger to help manage your FP due to Thundercloud Form's high cost. Moving along to the infusible heavy thrusting swords, first we have the Great Epee. The Great Epee has an R2 that slashes, allowing you to hit multiple enemies more easily or mobile targets, and deals physical damage. It's the lightest heavy thrusting sword in Elden Ring, weighing 6.5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to use. The Great Epee is the go-to option for those wishing to use a heavy thrusting sword from the very beginning of the game, but it is the shortest one. It deals similar damage to the Godskin Stitcher, even if it is slightly less with most infusions, but it has a different R2 attack that can be useful for cleaving through multiple enemies or hitting fast-moving targets that thrust attacks are likely to miss. You'll have the highest attack rating with the fire or lightning infusions, followed closely by Sacred and Flame Art, and then finally Magic. Heavy outperforms Keen, but only by a small amount, making either option perfectly viable, and Cold is somewhere in between them as another good option. Because Fire, Heavy, and Cold are good options, I highly recommend going the Strength route and using this weapon with a great shield for block counters as well as turtling behind the shield while attacking. You can use a nasty combo of block counter followed by a quick L2 if you're using the Impaling Thrust Ash of War to stagger almost anything, leaving you open for a critical attack. Use Shard of Alexander, Curved Sword Talisman, Dagger Talisman, and Ritual Sword Talisman to boost your damage when set up this way. And the last heavy thrusting sword is of course the Godskin Stitcher. The Godskin Stitcher has a charged R2 that thrusts twice, not unlike Roger's Rapier, and deals physical damage. It's one of the lightest heavy thrusting swords in Elden Ring, weighing 7, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to wield. The Godskin Stitcher has the second highest attack rating of all heavy thrusting swords, but loses out to the Great Epee if you're going the heavy route and is slightly longer. It's a great choice to apply status effects because of its charged R2 attack that hits twice rapidly, particularly Bleed, since this can be applied multiple times per fight easily. Fire and Lightning are the highest attack rating, with Sacred and Flame Art coming in second and Magic a close third. Keen actually outperforms Heavy with this weapon, though not by a huge amount, and Cold is another viable option if you want the status effect. The Blood Infusion puts you at 519 attack rating, which is about 65 lower attack rating than the Bloody Helice, so you're going to have to decide if you want lower attack rating but freedom to pick a different Ash of War, or if you want the higher damage and locked into the Dyna's Finesse weapon skill. I recommend going the Blood route and using something like Seppuku to further increase your bleed buildup with your charged R2 attacks, playing similarly to the way I played my Crimson Duelist build. However, note that you must fully charge the R2 to get 2 strikes, which makes it a bit more challenging to pull off. Also, you don't always need to charge R2, so don't get carried away trying to always trigger this. Sometimes an R1 chain or R2 followed up by an R1 is more than enough, and usually after a charged R2, you can follow with another regular R2 to trigger Hemorrhage. Use talismans like Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, and the Axe Talisman to boost your attack power higher, and use the White Mask if you want further damage. Make sure you have high poise so you can trade hits with spamming charged R2 attacks. That wraps up our video on heavy thrusting swords. There were only 4 in this one, but I hope it gives you some information that can help you make a better judgment about which one you want to use in your build and how to use it effectively. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring builds and content throughout this week and next, although we will have some more Hogwarts Legacy videos sprinkled in there as well, so you can look forward to those. If you have a particular weapon video you want to see next, please let me know in the comments. This helps me decide which ones to focus on.
Bye.